So my name is Amy Dallas. I am one of the 4 co-founders of ClutchPlay Games down in Portland, Oregon, and I'm also on the board of directors of OGO. So OGO stands for the Oregon Games Organization, and that's basically a group of games professionals from all across the state of Oregon. And we've kind of banded together within the last year to raise awareness and support the games industry down there. And that's something that we really need because we do have a lot of talent down in Oregon, but we don't have is the infrastructure, I think, to really kind of take our industry to the next level. So that's what we're all about, and we've got some really cool initiatives happening. If anybody wants to hear more, come find me this afternoon or hit me up on Twitter. I'd be glad to tell you more about it. So before we dive in, I just want to give you a little background on ClutchPlay. So ClutchPlay consists of 4 people. It's myself, Bernie Rismiller, John Worsley, and John Guest. And the 4 of us have actually been working together for, let's say, about 6 years now. But only half of that time has actually been as an indie studio. Before we started ClutchPlay, we worked for a company called Stumptown Game Machine, which was the Portland development studio of NG Moko. We worked on the Touch Pets Dogs and Cats series. It's a pretty successful franchise in its day, but unfortunately, our studio got shut down after NG Moko was acquired, and the parent company decided to consolidate all their development efforts down in San Francisco. And so literally the next day, 4 of us got together, we opened up ClutchPlay, and we have never looked back. So, like a lot of indie studios, we divide our time pretty evenly between doing work for hire and developing our own titles. We actually have 2 out right now. The first one is called Little Chomp, which I often refer to as our indie starter pancake, because we made all of our most painful mistakes on that game, and the beneficiary of all those mistakes and lessons that we learned was our second game, Skullduggery. And we've had some really nice successes with Skullduggery, not the least of which was a lot of love from Apple, which literally took me years to figure out how to even possibly make that happen. So that was kind of a big deal to us. So when you look at both of these games as a whole, like if you look at them together, there are a lot of similarities between the 2. So they're both what we kind of jokingly refer to at ClutchPlay as platflingers. So they're platformers with a, they share a kind of variations of a similar fling-based physics mechanic. So it's kind of like Angry Birds meets a Nintendo platformer. So it's something really different. We hadn't seen anybody do anything like that before. And so both of these games have, similar amount of content, similar amount of polish. They're both kind of quirky and fun and weird and silly. But they have one fundamental difference between these 2 titles, and that is that one dramatically outperformed the other. And so I want to talk about 3 factors that I think caused Little Chomp to underperform, and by factors I mean mistakes, and what we learned from those. So let's start out with fail factor number 1, consensus-based decision-making. So coming from the studio system, like this corporate environment that we had all worked in before, you're used to the fact that there's a lot of structure and hierarchy. And so part of that is you have to make peace with the fact that there's always people above you making decisions that directly impact your life, but over which you have absolutely no control. And that's part of the equation. And the ultimate example of that is, of course, having your studio shut down. That is the ultimate loss of control. And so when we started out our company, we thought, this is great because we actually finally have control over our destiny. This is fantastic. But the way that kind of manifested is all of us really felt like we wanted to weigh in on every single decision that we were, that was involved in our company, whether it was projects or company related. Everybody wanted to have a say, which put us in this inherent position of needing to achieve consensus on everything. And it's hard enough to get 4 people to agree on anything, but when you require that they agree on everything, that's just mayhem. And what would often happen is that we would seem to almost across the board split into 2 teams of 2, and we would sit around duking it out, trying to figure out which side was the right side. And that's actually why I use this image here, because I think it's the perfect embodiment of what happens, especially when you have an even number of people. It's always this double-decker wrestling match of whose side is going to win. And I want to make it clear, I think that consensus can be a great thing, but I also think it can be really challenging. So not only is it super inefficient and at times painful, it can also lead to compromises that just shouldn't be made. So case in point, our good friend, Little Chomp. So pretty early on in our development process, we hit a pretty deep philosophical divide about what we all thought the game should be. And again, it's 2 versus 2. So 2 of us felt like we should be making a game that was aimed at an older audience who really liked a challenging platformer, so teens to adults, people who grew up playing Nintendo and wanted that kind of experience on mobile. And our other 2 partners, both of whom have small children, were like, you know, that's cool, but we should also add some kid-friendly features. And the other 2 of us weren't so sure about that because the game was kind of hard, but they're like, no, if we do this, it'll appeal to a broader audience. And we hadn't really figured out the whole marketing thing at that point, so we're like, well, I guess that makes sense. All right, you win, let's do it. And so we did it, and we learned a very, very painful lesson straight out of the gate, which is when you try to make a game that appeals to everyone, you ultimately are making a game that appeals to no one, or at least that's the risk. And so when we got our first rounds of reviews in, that was the critical thread that ran through all of them. Like, they were positive reviews, we got good scores, but all the reviewers seemed to feel that, and rightfully so, the Little Chomp suffered from an identity crisis. And it did, because it looked like a kid's game, but it was too hard for kids, and adults who would find it really fun and challenging would probably, you know, they would be put off by the cutesy cute look to it. So this was actually a pretty hard lesson to learn because we had invested 9 months in that project, and really, honestly, Little Chomp never really did find its audience, and I think that that is a huge reason why. And so what we learned from that was the lesson of role clarity. And so from that point forward, the way that we kind of structured our business was whenever we have any decision and we aren't instantly agreeing, we go into that discussion with a very clear understanding of who the decision maker is. So there's 4 of us on our team. We all have pretty diverse backgrounds, which means that we each have an area of expertise. And so when we start discussing something that affects somebody's specific area of expertise, they're the ones who get to make that decision. That doesn't mean they can go make it in a vacuum. They can't just run off and do whatever they want. But what it does mean is that they can listen to everybody's arguments and say, I heard you, you made some fine points, but I fundamentally disagree and we need to do this for this reason. And that has actually helped us a lot, not only just as a company as a whole, but it's also helped Skullduggery. The time we spent in Skullduggery in meetings and going back and forth about what we should and shouldn't do was dramatically decreased. And the efficiency was improved, our focus was improved. It was just a great, great thing for our company. So I highly recommend role clarity whenever possible. So, all right, fail factor number 2, a lack of objectivity. Whenever I think of objectivity as related to game development, I kind of flash back to this thing that happened at PAX Prime this past summer. So we're demoing Skullduggery in the booth all weekend, and it's completely exhausting. And so I didn't get out that much, but when I did get out, I was really wanting to just go find a game that didn't have a long line and sit down for 5 minutes and play so I could feel like a normal human being and not a demo bot. And so I'm like, okay, I'm gonna find a game to play. And so at one point, I find this one game, it has not a very long line, and I sit down to play it, and I almost instantly realize why it doesn't have a long line. So, the natural process of playing a game is you sit down, you try to figure stuff out right away, and so that's what I tried to do. And I just found that there was not really much of a tutorial, and the UI was confusing, and the gameplay I just didn't get, and I did everything that made sense to me. And apparently I was doing it wrong because the developer was literally standing behind me like this going, no, that's not how it works, no. And it was super stressful. Like, there was a point where I was like, I want to punch you in the throat right now because I just kind of want to sit here and relax, and you're just stressing me out like crazy. And I was not the only one to have this experience with this guy, because a lot of people over the weekend were like, wow, you are so much nicer than that guy over there who's just like Ragey McRagerson freaking out because I don't know how to play his game. And on the one hand, it's easy to go, dude, this is not my failing. This is your failing, because this is your game, and you don't ship yourself with every copy of your game, and you don't get to explain how to play it. But at the same time, I also had a lot of compassion for him, because we've all been there. It's really sucky to sit someone down in front of your game and watch them not understand it or not enjoy it. And I think that's why a lot of us kind of sometimes shy away from opportunities to look for that objective feedback. Because it's really hard to accept when someone doesn't love your game, and especially when you're so close to it. A lot of indies work in isolation, and so it's really easy to lose perspective and be blind to the flaws of your game. And for this reason, I think sometimes there's a natural tendency to want to get your game as perfect as you can possibly get it, and then show it to people. And that is totally what we did on Little Chomp. We tried to get the game as far along as we could get it, and then we showed it to people, and it was pretty late in the process, and we found out that a lot of our assumptions were really off, and people just weren't understanding certain fundamental parts of that game. And so because we were so far along, it took us a lot more time to pull all that apart and fix it. And in retrospect, it's funny because we spent so much time trying to figure out what players wanted and needed, and we could have just asked them, and we didn't. So that was a pretty big learning point. So because we understand that we just got too close to it, all four of us got a little too invested early on Skullduggery, on Little Chomp, we decided to do things really differently on Skullduggery. So when we started our second game, we actually did kind of what Double Fine has conceived of the Amnesia Fortnite kind of model. So we split off into 2 teams of 2. This time that was a good thing. And we each worked on a prototype for a couple weeks. We came together, we looked at it, we looked at them both, and we decided which one was the best option. And ultimately, the game we picked turned out to be Skullduggery. But the image on the left, the black and white one, that's actually how that game started out. And so it was a very different game than where it ended up. That's the image on the right. So the prototype of Skullduggery started out as a traditional platformer in which you played a skeleton who could run around the world, and the way you jumped was actually by pulling back on the screen, and you would throw your head, and wherever your skull landed, your bones would pop up out of the ground, and you could keep running. So that sounds cool, right? That sounds like a really interesting idea. And it was. But when the two of us who had not worked on that prototype sat down to play it, what we realized was it was confusing because there were 2 different control schemes. There was the virtual joystick to run around, then there was the swiping motion to throw your head. And so once the novelty wore off, which happened pretty quickly, it just became annoying and confusing. So when we tried to give our 2 partners that feedback, they reacted exactly the same way as the PAX guy, and they're like, no, man, you don't get it, you're not getting it. And so we were like, okay, I know what's happening here. So we actually brought in some people. We had a shared office space at the time. We brought them in and we asked them to look at it, and they gave the exact same feedback that we did. You know, it's cool, but it's confusing and novelty wears off. So what became very clear was the fun part of the game was the throwing the head part. It wasn't the running around part. So we're like, okay, let's make a game about a disembodied skull. And so that's what Skullduggery is about. You basically play a semi-organic autonomous skull who works for the Infernal Revenue Service collecting taxes from the deadbeats of the afterlife. So as you can see, the way it actually, so we went full on indie weird there. So as you can see the way it works, you can see his brain stretching. So you pull back on the screen, it stretches out his brain, you let go, and it snaps him forward like a brainy rubber band. So that was actually a pretty amazing outcome, because I think if all 4 of us had been working on that prototype, I guarantee you we would have spent months trying to figure out how to make the running and the throwing work, and it probably just wouldn't have. So another thing in terms of getting objective feedback is, for Skullduggery, we showed that game at every conference we possibly could get it into. We literally showed it to hundreds of people, actually probably including PAX, thousands of people before it actually launched. And this was also amazing. We got so much useful feedback that could be a whole talk in and of itself. So I highly recommend that. I know a lot of you are probably showing here this weekend, and that is a great thing. I'm sure you will get a lot out of it. Okay, so let's talk about fail factor number 3, the failiest of all the fail factors. This one, it really pains me, because it pains me to admit that we got sucked into the swirling vortex of magical thinking that is Field of Dreams syndrome, and yet we are not alone. This is a siren song that many people have sort of hurled themselves into. So let's talk about what that is. So Field of Dreams syndrome, if you've been living under a cinematic rock and you've never heard this term, it's a quote from a movie, and it goes, little something like, if you build it and it doesn't suck, they will come. I added the doesn't suck part, but you kind of get the general idea. And this is a fine premise for a movie, but I'll be really blunt. It's a super shitty marketing strategy. It is not a smart marketing strategy. And I think the reason why, though, it's so dangerous is in the wording itself. If you build it, it's all about building. It's not if you market it. It is if you build it. And I think that's why this is such an alluring trap for so many of us, is it strikes at the heart of who we are. We are game developers. We're not marketers. If we wanted to be marketers, we'd go get a job marketing. We wanted to make games. And we want to make cool games, and we want to believe that making a cool game is enough. And tragically, it is not. Because, as we all know, discoverability is the biggest problem that all of us have. Because every platform, no matter what you're developing for, PC, console, mobile, it doesn't matter. Everything is really, really overcrowded at this point. And so, you're competing with larger companies with big marketing budgets who are competing for the same eyeballs that you are. And so, this is a really tough thing when you're an indie, because you have to be really smart about your marketing choices, how you put your game out into the world. And that is a very fundamental paradigm shift in how we think. Because marketing deals with the who, what, when, where, and why, and development largely deals with how. So it's a pretty tempting thing to just focus on the how and worry about everything else later. And so, of course, that is what we did. We kind of fell back as a development team on what we were comfortable with. We worked as a corporate development team before. We made projects that were on time, on budget, fun, successful, and so marketing always just seemed to take care of itself. But what was kind of opaque to us is that there was this whole marketing team down in San Francisco doing all these things that we had no visibility into. And so we did what a lot of people do. We threw our game out into the world, and then we tried to market it. And we learned a very painful lesson, that once your game goes live, honestly, it's really hard to market it. It's hard to get anybody to care about it, because it's not newsworthy anymore. There's no anticipation. There's no buildup. It's just a thing waiting to be discovered. And the same thing goes for the platforms. I don't know what we were thinking on this project. I think we just thought that maybe somehow we'd be discovered in, when you submit it. Maybe that's how you get featured, because we really had no insight into that. And that is not how that works at all. The platforms all have editorial calendars, and features are determined weeks and sometimes even months before a game comes out. So if you're not on their radar before your game goes live, it's probably just not going to happen. And so this was exactly what happened. We had a very hard time getting press, and fortunately, I ended up running into someone that became a friend, and he gave me some really great PR tips. He's a PR person, and so I'll share some of those with you in a minute. But using some of the advice he gave me, I was able to make a persuasive enough pitch that someone from IGN decided to review the game, and he did. He gave us a high score, and that made us maybe a little more newsworthy to some people, because they're hard graders. But still, it was an uphill battle. We also got featured in the PAX East Indie Showcase. That helped us a little bit, but we made things really hard on ourselves to get press, and the press that Skullduggery got was an order of magnitude greater than Little Chomp as a result. So the big key learning point there is your marketing efforts are every bit as important as any piece of development that you do. So you have to schedule them like everything else. You have to schedule press events. Press events, getting those in your schedule are also really great because they help to keep you focused and on target throughout the course of your development. And also having things like press kits, promo videos, social media plans, all of that being part of your schedule is really critical. And also, of course, marketing efforts should start well in advance of your launch. And in the case of Skullduggery, we started our marketing, literally we had 3 prototype levels, and we started with that, with our marketing efforts about 8 months before we launched. We were taking it to trade shows, we were actually putting it in front of press, which can be a little risky, but it paid off for us because it gave us 2 major advantages. One is awareness. We got the word out there about the game. The press was aware of it, players were aware of it, platforms became aware of it, and it also gave us an opportunity for refinement. Every time you pitch your game, I think we all start out kind of thinking we know what's good about our game. But the more you pitch it to people, the more you start to really refine and hone in and understand what makes it special. Which brings me to my last set of slides. So these are some of the tips that my PR friends gave me that were incredibly helpful. And of course, you'll notice first on the list is understand what truly makes your game unique. And that's kind of not always as easy as you would think, because we're all just tempted to go, oh, my game is great because I made it. It's like everybody's child is a genius kind of thing. And so just really honing in on what makes your game newsworthy. So for example, when we're talking about our games, one of our unique sales propositions is that we've made platformers that are actually tailored to touchscreen devices. So rather than having, again, that virtual joystick, we have a touch-based game mechanic, and that's unusual, and so that made it kind of newsworthy. The other thing is to tell an interesting story, and I know that sounds really kind of basic, but it's kind of amazing how many people don't do that. And this is actually something I've heard from press people directly. You have to start thinking like a press person when you're pitching your game. You have to put yourself in their shoes. And they see games all the time, constantly. They probably see a lot of derivative titles. So you want to kind of help them to understand what is it about your game that is kind of worthy of coverage. It can be a story about your game, your process, your company, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just kind of include some details about that. Also, another big one, don't rely on tips and links in generic forms on game sites. I totally did this in the beginning. It's like, oh, send your things to ReviewMonkey, and you know, it's just a yawning black hole of badness. Like these links and email aliases get literally hundreds, maybe thousands of emails a day, and so it's just a non-starter. So if you actually want people to cover your game, the best thing to do is seek out people who do reviews on the kind of game you've made, specifically like stalk them on Twitter or go Google the crap out of them. It's amazing how easy it is to find an email address if you really want to, which makes me sound stalkery and weird, but that's what you need to do. And it really helps to kind of build those personal connections with the press because, you know, obviously if they know you over time, they're more likely to cover you. And also, the last thing is don't hound, but do follow up. And that's kind of hard to do. It's always a little scary reaching out to the game press, even when you know them. You know how busy they are. You know how many people are after their attention. And so it's tempting to just go, oh, I didn't hear anything. Okay, forget about it. And there was one case in Skullduggery that was a really interesting lesson for us. So I had met this one press guy through the course of all of our marketing efforts, and I'd showed him an early build of Skullduggery, and he seemed like he was interested. So I sent him a promo code when we launched on iOS, and I didn't hear anything. And so I screwed up my guts, and I reached back out to him, and I told him this story about the fact that we were at PAX, and we had so many people coming up to us when we were at PAX saying, wow, that is such a cool game mechanic. I'm totally going to steal that. Like, I can't even tell you how many people said that to us, and we're like, okay, well, thanks. That's cool. And so kind of made us a little edgy. We're like, oh, well, okay, are we actually going to, like, earn anything from this game? Are we actually going to get anything out of this thing we worked years trying to perfect? And so I told him the story, and I was like, you know, any coverage would really help us a lot. We'd really appreciate it. And he wrote back to me a couple days later with a link to his review. And he's like, you know, I'm really glad you reached out to me because you sent me the promo code, I looked at it, it didn't grab my attention right away, and I put it down. And when I got your email, I was like, okay, fair enough. Let me try it again. And the second time, I really liked it. I don't even know why it didn't grab me the first time. That's a really fun game. Here's your review. So it just kind of goes to show, if you don't give up and if you're smart about it, you can still, you know, you can still make things happen. So I think that's pretty much my time. I don't know, maybe there's time for one question?
Awesome presentation. So you can either have the mic or you can project out and then you can paraphrase the question. So you do.
You started out by saying that you somehow found a way to get love from Apple. Can you give us a little insight into how you got the love from Apple?
That's a tricky one, because Apple doesn't always want you to talk about that. The one piece of advice I'd give you, because this is the white whale of my job. I spent literally years trying to figure it out. And I sat down with a publisher one day, and I just point blank asked him, like, how do you get a bat phone to Apple? Like, you guys have one, I want a bat phone, how do I get it? And he basically gave me a piece of information that blew my mind, so I'll share it here. WWDC, the Worldwide Developer Conference from Apple, it's next month. It's super expensive. I think it's like $1,600 a ticket. But if you go to WWDC, they have what is known as an App Store lab, which I did not know. And the App Store lab allows you to go in and book an appointment for 15, 20 minutes and to sit down and show your game to someone from Apple who works in the App Store. That was like a huge revelation to me. That is a big, big deal, because I literally walked the floor of all these conferences. We were showing it at conferences. We never ran into anyone from Apple. And I'm like, wow, you can just go and meet somebody? And so I did that. And you're not guaranteed to get someone in your category, but what you are guaranteed is to sit down with someone who can actually say, oh, okay, I see where you're going there. Have you thought about localization? Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And it also puts you on their radar. And so that is a big, big thing. I highly recommend it. It is expensive, and it's a crapshoot. It doesn't mean you're going to necessarily get anything out of it, but it is an opportunity that I honestly could not find anywhere else. So that helped us a lot.
Okay, last question. What are you working on now? What's next?
Good question. We're actually doing some contract work at the moment, to be perfectly honest. But we actually have we're doing a bake-off again. So we're working on a couple of different prototypes and trying to see which one is the winner. So haven't decided yet.
If you do your next game, will you do a version 2 of one of your existing games, or just start something fresh, new concept?
Well, you know, it's funny. We do like this fling thing. And so every time we do it, we want to do something a little different with it, if that's what we're going to do. But we also have another thing that we're like, haven't seen anybody do that before either. So that's what we're kind of balancing right now.
We'll promise not to steal it. Thank you very much. That was awesome.
Thank you.